Welcome to Bring the World Home, a production of the Returned Peace Corps Volunteers of Hawaii. My name is Chip Tilton. I served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Malaysia from 1966 to 1968, and I will be your host for today's program. During this program, we will be sharing with you one Peace Corps volunteer's experiences from abroad. Hopefully, our message of friendship and family with people of all countries and cultures is exhibited in each of our shows. With us today is Leanne Iwamoto, who served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Belize from 1994 to 1996. Welcome, Leanne.
Thank you, Chip. I'm happy to be here today.
Oh, we're eager to find out about this country of Belize. It's a place that I don't know very much about. The name's kind of familiar, but what's some of the background?
I think most people are familiar with the previous name of Belize, which was British Honduras. It was a British colony, and it changed over in 1981. And Peace Corps went in to help with that transition, I believe, to send in people to help people in the agricultural field and health, and I went to help with education.
Oh, wonderful. And so you were part of a group that went in as what level of teaching?
Well, there were 5 of us in our group, and we were sent to help with some of the refugees that were coming into Belize from some of the surrounding nations. Belize is located, here's Hawaii here on the globe, and then if you look right beneath Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula, right beside Guatemala, Belize is located right here along the Caribbean. And there were 5 of us sent to work with the refugees from Honduras and Guatemala and even Nicaragua, and some from El Salvador, and to help them with their English to integrate into the Belizean society. But what happened was the process takes, quite a while, several months to a year, to get into Peace Corps or to finally leave once you go through the process of starting.
Yes.
That it had changed over the political situation, and the status of refugees had changed. So from our initial planning to go to teach English, we ended up going to be rural community development workers. So we were placed in 5 different villages, and we basically had to figure out what we were going to do to best help the community that we lived in.
And you're, the changeover in the politics of a Central American country is sounds kind of stereotypic, but I'm sure your experiences were anything but. When you arrived in a village, a town, a city, what was the size of the location?
Belize has about a little bit more than 250,000 people, so it's not a very large place, and it's scattered, throughout the area. Okay. I was sent to the south, and in the south they mainly had the Mayan people. I was sent to a Quechua Mayan village, and they also had in the main town near us, like 15 miles away, they mainly Creole, which was just the basic Belizean person, and the Garifuna, which were African descendants. So it was quite a diverse area to live in. My village was called Indian Creek, and it was stretched out over 2 miles, maybe about 400 people or so, and I was placed in a, I guess people refer to it as a hut. So, if you take a look at this picture here, there's a picture of me, not a picture of me, but of the house that I had built there. And it's made out of thatch roof, and the boards are fairly close together, but that's not necessarily common for the people that live there, because they basically put up the walls with whatever wood they can find. And it's really quite an interesting thing. There's dirt floor. And one thing I was joking with my friend about was the fact that I didn't have to buy a broom, for my house, because we had a dirt floor. And she had a wooden floor in her house, and I was like, I don't need a broom. And then after a week of living in my village, I remember somebody coming over and saying, "Why aren't you sweeping your floor?" And I was thinking, why would I sweep the floor? Because it's just dirt. I just couldn't imagine, somebody
move
sweeping.
the dirt around.
That's
a little
right.
bit.
But what they did was they made me a broom out of a certain type of leaves from a tree, and they taught me that there is a harder layer of the dirt. And so what you do is you sweep off the top layer of dirt that comes off, and you
dusty
sift.
layer.
Yeah, the dusty layer actually comes off, and there's like a harder area, and you can sift that out so that the rocks or whatever else would come out of it, and so you have very fine dirt. And then you mix that dirt with water, and you can patch up your floor. So actually, some floors actually almost look like concrete. It's really quite interesting.
Well, and your living quarters existed for you when you arrived, or did you?
Well, I rented a place that used to be a church. So there's the newer church right outside my home, and then I had a place built on the community land and it was going to go to the sewing project after I left, and I got some men to get the post for me from the jungle area, and then basically they chop all the leaves and the community comes together. It's a really interesting thing, I guess, like the old barn raising on the mainland, where the community would come together to help each other build the house. And so the whole community came out, and the men would just be standing upon the rafters of the roof and tying the leaves down for my house.
A
it was
community effort.
A nice thing.
That reminds me, I'd like to go back just a little bit. So you arrived in the country, you kind of had an assignment, you said, but the assignment changed. And after the change is when you came to this village?
That's right. So we already knew we were going to be going in, that we could possibly teach English and maybe do some literacy, since there was a literacy campaign happening in Belize. Belize was known for having 97% literacy in the country. But in terms of what that was based on, it's really unclear, because a lot of the people were not literate. You know, they would have to sign with the X and have somebody witness that they were able to get whatever documentation they needed. So we were sent in. Belize, even though it's within a Latin American community, is really more Caribbean because of that British presence, and because of the English. They have a Creole, which is similar to what we have here in Hawaii, Pidgin, and so they speak a form of English, which is mainly understandable, but they do have other words that are, you know, part of that language. So even within that, you know, to teach them English that would be, you know, a little bit more universal.
And you mentioned that there's 5 basic cultures, ethnic cultures in the country, and you had said that the language that you spoke was Quechua Mayan.
That's right.
And is that similar to Spanish, or and it's a Latin American country, or in Latin America, but or is it a Mayan or indigenous kind of language?
It's an indigenous language, so it's a lot more basic than Spanish is. There are a few Spanish words that are incorporated within the language, but for the most part it sounds different. Say somebody was coming up to my house, then I would hear them say kabanu. This is what you kind of hail a greeting as you approach, so you're not going to, you know, surprise somebody as you come up to their house. And that basically means, you know, some kind of hello. They don't really have a word for hello. And then the person, you know, from the house says, Okan se kabl, which means, you know, enter the house, hilan, and they have usually hammocks that are hung from the rafters. That's their main bed, chair, you know, all-purpose, cradle, you know, and you sit in their hammock, and then, you know, they may ask you, how are you? Masa acho, which actually just the literal translation is your heart happy? And then you could say, Sain cho, my heart is happy. You know, I really like that, just that idea of how they're looking at, you know, the inner person as well.
Well, how did they view you as an American coming to their country after being a British colony? Was there any lingering resentment, or were they happy to have it?
I didn't really get that, but the Peace Corps is quite favorable in Belize, and it is interesting that I don't have the face of the normal person that they would think would come from the United States. So that was really interesting for me to represent Hawaii as one of the states. And they actually thought I was Mopan Maya, which is the Mayan, a different type of Mayan in a village nearby. And so they have a different language also. So some of them would try to speak to me in that, thinking I was pretending, you know, to come in and say I'm a Peace Corps volunteer, when really I was actually just a Mopan Maya. But I thought it was kind of interesting.
I've read that the Mayan culture was a very great culture and sometime in history. Is that the case?
Yes, they have the La Ruta Maya, which is the Mayan route, which would be including the Yucatan Peninsula, and they have ruins all throughout that area, with the main one in Guatemala, which is Tikal. But we did have one part of the ruins in our village, and not only part of the pyramids, but they had what would be like engraved carvings, and they would have pictures, and they would have some of their hieroglyphs that would give dates and information, names of the people. And we actually had the second largest in the world stela, and it was a picture of this man, and he had this giant hat, like a plumage with feathers, and it was called Nimli Punit, which means big hat in Mayan, you know. And it was interesting because it's related that when he was about to die, what he did was he went and somewhere into the jungles to hide this, just jeweled hat somewhere.
Yes.
And then he came back and without the hat, and they never quite figured out where that hat was hidden. So, these legends that come through the culture.
So that's probably what Indiana Jones is going to search for next.
I think so. I think that's Indiana Jones 4.
One thing that I find very interesting is that here in Hawaii we have what I would call a host culture, the Hawaiian culture, and it's viewed with, if you will, varying degrees of respect here in this country. And in what I'm hearing about Belize is that the Mayan culture was the reigning culture for however
a long time. I'm not sure exactly.
But today, or when you were there, was it respected as a host culture, or as Western influence, or British influence?
I would say that there
kind of overpowered it.
A lot of similarities maybe between the Hawaiian people and some of the struggles they have, and some of the maybe abuses in history that they've suffered, to the Mayans that I lived with in my village. Most of the Mayans were subsistence farmers, which means that it's really difficult, and it depends on the weather for how well they do. They were very, in terms of life expectancy, wasn't as high as the other ethnicities in Belize. Their education wasn't as high because many of them got married quite young and started raising their families at 14 or 15 years old. And so many of them dropped out of school maybe after 4th or 5th grade. Just to help either at home with all the the larger families that they had, and also just to help on the farms. And it was just interesting how unfortunate it was, because there was just a high infant mortality rate. There was malaria was really large in my village, and maybe about 2 or 3 people died within that span of time that I was there in my village. Just one young girl, and part of it is kind of related to the superstitions that they had. Say I go into somebody's house, and or say somebody comes to visit me, and the baby or the young child is frightened by me. They would they could go home and say they get sick after that, and so they feel like the fear is related to the sickness. And so what they would come to do then is to cut part of my hair off and burn the hair on, some of it was like a wood, you'd have to, get your own charcoal, whatever, burn the hair and cause the baby to smell that. And it would chase the sickness away. And that one girl, there was a truck that drove by the village, and they really felt that it was related, the fear that came upon her because of that incident. They weren't able to contact the man, and she ended up just being completely dehydrated, and they wouldn't take her into the hospital. It was really costly. They couldn't afford it. It was just a really sad situation, that just death is so much a part of the life that was there.
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
I can see how that would be quite a contrast coming from
really
our background in the United States. What was the main difference or differences that struck you, say, your first year in country coming from the United States? Now, in our earlier conversation, Leanne, you had told me that you were born in Hilo, and that you had traveled a bit before ending up in the Peace Corps in Belize. Nonetheless, you arrived there as an American, and what was your reaction to the circumstances that you...
I was really happy to have, what would be more like the true Peace Corps experience. The village I went to was not with electricity, and I lived in a thatch house, like I mentioned earlier, and had a machete that I would chop my yard, and I paid somebody to bring me firewood since you had to cook on an open fire, and I would take my baths during the day at the river, and I would take my clothes at the same time, and I'd have to wash it on a rock and then just hang it up. The women usually did the washing and the bathing during the day, and the men would, usually use the same site maybe toward the evening after they came home from the farms. And there was also a banana farm in my village, and they would come home after that. So it was just a lifestyle being just a lot harder. We did have water that was piped to the house, which was different because they had a project come in to do that for the village. But most of the other places either had to pump water or carry water from the river for their homes. So it was a lot, physically harder lifestyle. I was issued a bicycle, so when I did end up teaching some literacy classes, I would bike 2 miles to teach a class on my bicycle, and then another 5 miles to teach another class on the bicycle.
Yes.
And if not, I just have to walk everywhere, you know. And so that was a big change here, where we can just use a car or flush the toilet. You know, we
Right.
just had to use an outhouse type of facility there, or just the bush.
One of the things that certainly when I was in the Peace Corps in the middle 60s, they didn't want volunteers to stand out apart or live a lifestyle that was different materially or otherwise from the host country nationals. Do you feel that the people in your village looked at you as some kind of special American, or an American or a foreigner who required special treatment or special dispensation of some sort, or did they were you embraced as one of them? And
I think I tended to fit in fairly well. What I brought with me today, some of the clothing here, that I would wear to fit in more. You know, so the skirt, you know, it's similar to what the Mayans wore in Guatemala, and it would, you know, represent the area that they're from. But they would wear this traditional ook, which was the skirt.
Ook.
Ook. And then they would have a bead necklace and a top that's similar to that. This is the Mopan Maya one, but the Quechua Maya, they actually wore just like a T-shirt or something with slippers and the skirt. And
let me ask you something about the ook. The weaving, the design of the weave seems very familiar to me. I had a friend who lived in Guatemala, and I had a number of articles of clothing and accessories that had that kind of unique weave. Is this wool or cotton?
This is cotton, and then it is quite extensive to make. It's quite a process, the weaving process. And
it looks like it.
I would say a week to 2 weeks just to make the stretch of material, and then they would cut it and then put the elastic for the waist part of it.
And do they grow the cotton, or they purchase cotton thread?
They
or?
just get the thread now. I think before they, you know,
And the
maybe-
dyes are
and the
local?
dyes also they would have purchase also.
And then you have some other items here while we're talking about it.
I do have a picture with me of a woman weaving, and she's you know, strapped in with the wooden pieces that would cause the shuttle to be able to go back and forth, to be able to weave different types of things. And they would just sit you know, on a rock or something, like she's seated there, and you know, the chickens and the other animals are running around. I have an example of a type of bag that she would be weaving, and this is something that the men used in our village to plant corn. This is called a koshtal, and see, this is...
How do you say that again?
Koshtal.
Koshtal.
And so they would have, you have to weave the pieces separately. This would be one piece on the bottom that they fold over and sew together, and then they would weave the strap here. And the bag was for the men, and they would use it to put their corn in, the seed to plant, and then the beans to plant also.
And what did they use to plow with?
Some of them may have horses or whatever. If not, they would just have to manually...
Drag a stick or
that's right.
something
They
of
would
that
just
sort.
use a hoe.
Deposit seeds.
That's right.
And is there any significance attached to the color combinations, or would the...
Well,
I noticed that they
like a lot of color.
a lot of bright,
That's right.
lively...
They like color,
color.
and so I think some of the color, maybe to what we're used to, you know, in the Western world or in America, doesn't always fit together. I liked this bag, and they gave me this bag when I was leaving, but it just varied. I mean, they like it colorful, so they'll use whatever thread they have available to weave that in.
So after they grow the corn, and then they harvest and mill corn for corn flour, and
Yes, they
that
do.
must be what you use.
That's right.
What
So
is this for?
this other item here is called a komao, and this is what they use to cook with. I have a smaller one that I brought back with me, but usually families, you know, the typical family would be 5 or more people in their family, would have a larger one that they would have on the ground, maybe based on cinder blocks. And they would take the corn that they have taken off of the husk, and either they have to have a mill and grind it by hand, and you have to go through the mill twice, and it's really quite difficult to do. It takes a lot of work.
Labor intensive.
That's right, labor intensive. And that, or they could go to the corn mill and pay maybe 10 or 15 cents to have it ground for them. and that they could take it and come back with what they call the masa, and then they would use like pieces of plastic to then pad out the tortilla, and then they could cook it on the comal for the family.
And so while we're talking, I guess that would be the one of the staples of the diet. What would a typical meal be?
So it could be
say a lunch or a dinner.
Normally tortillas and beans, or rice and beans. And the tortillas, you could either have flour tortillas or you could have corn tortillas, depending on whether they had the corn, to mill, or the flour they could just buy from little shops in the village. Sometimes the people, after the first maybe 6 months, I decided I'd start eating with the family since it was easier. It took a lot of time to, make my own fire and prepare the food for myself, and still try to get out into the community and work with different groups. That I ate with the family, and they would always make sure that I had something with my tortillas to eat. So if nothing else, I would have an egg, and then you make sure that egg lasts you until you're full. You just eat tortillas until you fill up. And they would, if you didn't have the egg, you would just eat chili peppers with a tortilla, and that would be it. Mm-hmm. And you'd maybe drink a little instant coffee or just have some water.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. And mention having a beverage. Here we're so used to turning on the tap and getting a glass of water, or probably more typically today buying soda in a can at the store, or making tea or iced tea or something. For your village, was there, you said your dwelling had water piped in. Was the water quality acceptable? Or
for the most part. There was one time I did get sick, and then it affected me. But other than that, you could buy sodas at the shop. They did have this one drink that the Mayans are known for, and the Aztecs, the cacao, where they make a chocolate. And so they would pick the cacao from the plant, and it's actually, the fruit itself is very sweet. And so you could eat the fruit, and then you would have all the cacao beans, and they would roast it on something like the comal. And then you would you'd crush it into pieces, and then you would mix it with the water and add sugar. That was really, really nice.
And is that what chocolate is made from? Cacao?
That's right, yeah.
What, is it a large bean or a small bean?
It's about maybe this big, and then you have the beans within it are just like, pods, and it's wrapped around with this, it's almost like a sweet, like a sour sap type of fruit around the cacao bean itself.
And that's cultivated, or that was a wild growing fruit?
Some parts of Belize would cultivate it, and they would make chocolate out of it as to export. But for most people, they would just have a tree maybe in their yard or in the community, and they would just pick off as they needed for the beverage.
Well, we've talked a bit about the village life. Your contact with the rest of the country, maybe our viewers are interested. Was the country quite political in nature, or they were just existing? And
well, it was definitely, I was there in '94. They had just gotten their independence in 1981. The British military had just left, maybe within the past year or so. So the presence had been quite strong up until that point. The people were having a sense of nationalism, in terms of their own national anthem and their own government leaders established. But at the same time, Belize is a very stable country. It's not, like you don't have all these dictators coming in with a long history of that happening. So in terms of politics, you do have two, main parties that would go back and forth, like, a healthy democracy. But other than that, I didn't notice a lot of problems. We also, besides teaching English, also helped with community groups. And there was another volunteer in a nearby village, and she and I teamed up to work on that whole district, the southern district, the Toledo district, to get the women from the arts and craft groups to work together. And what normally happens is the village will pretty much elect what they call the alcalde, which is the mayor of the village. And I really like the process because they just get different men in the community to just rise up for the 2 years to just kind of make decisions and kind of gather people. And it's really interesting. A lot of them don't really like to be put in that position, but everyone takes turns doing that. And so the men have a big gathering of all the leaders called a fajina. So we decided that we would get the chair ladies from all these main arts and craft groups together, and we called them the chair lady fajina, and that by grouping together they would be able to market their their things to other places, whereas with one group, and they maybe could only make, 10 baskets and, a few koshtaos or whatever it would be, or a different shirt with the embroidery upon it. And, another group could maybe do another 15, another group could do another 50. But collectively, they could meet orders of 150 or 200, and that way they could, get their products out to the rest of the world.
Oh, that's very... It sounds like our neighborhood boards could embrace some of that possibilities. We have a few minutes left. I'd like to ask you a couple of other questions relating to your service, and that is, this program is Bring the World Home. How do you feel that your experience has been manifest in your life since you returned to the United States and to Hawaii in particular?
Well, I really like the third goal of the Peace Corps, of bringing and educating people about my experience. I'm a teacher, and I'm at Kalaheo High School teaching Spanish, and I really try to bring a lot of what I've gathered from my travels in that area in Belize to my classroom. I find that the students really enjoy hearing different stories about what took place while I was there, and the different lifestyle, and what a privilege it is to have that type of education up through, 17 or 18 years of age, whereas a lot of these other countries, it was such a hardship for them if they wanted to continue in high school, for the family to sacrifice to have that person be able to go to the only high school in the district. They would have to be bussed in, and some of them would even be housed there and stay there and only come back on vacation or on weekends. And to not have that extra member helping the family with income or the farming or with the household chores was really a sacrifice. And like I said, many of them did not continue school after the 4th or 5th grade.
Leanne, there's so much more to talk about, but we've come to the end of our program for today. We really appreciate your being here. I'd like to say to our viewers, to find out more about the Peace Corps, you can go to the website, and please join us next time when we visit another country and bring the world home.